I was trying to write a book called The Anatomy Book. It was a novel. It was maybe more than I wanted to admit at the time, influenced by Donna Tartt's Secret History. It was a campus novel about time travel, the multiverse. If you're familiar with The Secret History, you know that's about a group of kids who are obsessed with ancient Greece. But in this case, it was a graduate student and his research assistant who were falling in love and at the same time obsessed with this revolutionary era French philosopher who had discovered the secret to time travel and then been sentenced to death by the Communards, who were this revolutionary force who caused a lot of destruction in Paris in the late 19th century, late 18th century. And there was this whole Walter Benjamin aspect. I studied comp lit at Brown. There was a lot of that in there. It was obviously not the most commercial prospect, but that was not something I was thinking about at all. And I had spent 5 years trying to write this novel about time travel and the multiverse and Walter Benjamin, and really thought it was going to be the thing, that made me a writer with a capital W. And I had gotten reinforcement from the universe for that desire. I got into Yaddo with a section of this book. I got a full ride to NYU's creative writing program and worked on it there. I thought this was going to be like the thing, and I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have any sense of what would happen if I failed, and I did fail. And I drove myself directly into a brick wall. And the book that came out of that was No One Gets to Fall Apart, which is a memoir about that book's failure, along with my mom's psychotic break and the end of a long friendship, all of which happened kind of simultaneously.
So I read your memoir with a sense of recognition because it is in its way a book that is about its own making. And I feel like the kind of book that you might have been, whether you knew it or not, trying to avoid writing. And it feels like because of the struggles that you had with the anatomy book and these other life events and relationship events, you finally surrendered to it. And you finally started telling your story. And lo and behold, when you did that, the book really worked and found a publisher. And now here we are. Am I accurate in my assessment?
Oh, yeah, 100%. And this is a book that people had been telling me to write. In grad school, I had a fiction workshop with Jonathan Safran Foer, who, when I was growing up, was one of the marquee fiction names. He came out of Princeton, published his first book at 19. Everything is Illuminated, had this charmed career, and he was a good teacher. And he had us write one time as an assignment, write the thing that's nothing like anything you write ever, write the weird thing. And I wrote a short story about my mom's obsession with her dad's murder and the trauma that had led to for her and how that had impacted our relationship. And I turned it in and he was like, this is what you need to be writing. Stop writing the time travel novel. Lawrence Weschler, who was a big mentor of mine at NYU, also said, maybe stop with the weird kind of Walter Benjamin thing, which is great and cool and interesting, and write about your family. Everyone said to do it. And I was just like, well, no, I can't. It's too hard. I can't do it. My friend in the book, who I ended up having a terrible rupture with, also, who is a successful novelist, she's a poet in the book, said to me, this is the book that you're supposed to write about your family. It's the thing you're obsessed with. And I didn't think I could do it. I just thought it would be too hard. I don't know why I didn't. And then I did it and it worked.
What was it that finally, it was the failure of the anatomy book and the pain of it? I can imagine that might have led you to be like, okay, fine, I'm going to surrender and I'm going to try to write my own story in this memoir. But there were also other things going on. You mentioned the psychotic break that your mother had, which you write about in this book. You mentioned this rupture with a friend. Was it just some combination of all those things that finally put you at the keyboard ready to write this, or was it something else?
I'll say I think I'm a pretty stubborn person, just in general. If somebody tells me I should be doing something or I should act a certain way or write a certain way, I will just immediately gravitate towards the opposite thing. Somebody tells me to read a certain type of book, I'll just never read that book. So I think that was sort of the block around this book for me. And then I didn't want to write the story that at that time popped into my mind when someone was like, well, write about 3 generations of Black women in Texas. Write about your grandmother, who is a successful business owner who made it out of East Texas, and then your mom, who's had sort of these deep-seated mental problems her whole life, and then yourself, who has sort of found yourself midway between these 2 women. I didn't want to write what I thought that book would look like, but then it turned out that that book could look however I wanted it to. It didn't have to look like what I was imagining. So my entryway to this book, which starts with my mom on the side of the road thinking she's being chased by FBI agents, thinking she's under surveillance, 53 and experiencing a full psychotic break. That learning about that was where I started writing it. And that the reason I started writing it was because I had to, or else I thought I was going to die. Like, I didn't know how to process this. I couldn't find resources around it. I was going through like the failure of my novel. I was going through this friendship breakup. I just didn't have the capacity to hold that inside. And so it just like kind of erupted. And that was maybe the only way I ever would have written this book. It almost like forced itself out of me. It wasn't something that I approached thinking, oh, this is going to be a book. It was like, I'm going to write about this because it's the only power I have in this moment.
That feels familiar too. I feel like there are certain things that happen in our lives, and it can be any number of things, but they're just so big, kind of like monolithic and immovable, that you have no choice. Like, what are you going to do? You really going to write a novel about time travel while all this stuff is happening? Like, forget it. Like, it's not like you can try, but I just feel like I've been through things where it was just like, okay, I'm going to have to grapple with this in writing as a way of trying to process it. And I probably can't write anything else until I do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I felt like I had maybe gotten a little bit too wrapped up in kind of the jockeying for status and the hierarchies that come with wanting to be a successful literary fiction writer. Like, I went to Brown. A lot of people who graduated around the time I did are super successful in that world now.
Like who?
I mean, I was at Brown at the same time as Alex Kleeman, and I remember when she published that incredible short story in the Paris Review that launched her career. And we were friends when we were younger, and she was someone I really admired, and she worked so hard, and she had so much discipline. And like Molly Young, who I think now edits for the New York Times Book Review, Kevin Roos, who writes for the New York Times, so many people. I mean, this is Brown, you know? And I just felt like, okay, these people are models for me. These are people I'm jealous of. I'm going to let that jealousy drive me. Like, but I think that world can kind of make you sick. You can just get so tied up in like publication records and envy and fear that you won't accomplish the things that you think you need to make your life worthwhile. And maybe my specific personality was very subject to that. And then this thing happened with my mom, and I was just like thrust into reality in this way that like I couldn't think about fiction anymore. I couldn't care about applying for McDowell or trying to get into the New Yorker. Like, these things that had been so important to me just suddenly did not matter at all. And I could not understand how they had ever mattered to me. It was like an immediate thing. I just lost that. But I still had that thing in me where I'd been waking up at 5 a.m. to write this novel for 5 years. And so something had to fill that time and that vessel and that force within me that was trying to create this novel. And the memoir was the thing that basically took its place.
So with respect to your mental health, because you write about how you were depressed when it came to the failed novel. You obviously had a lot like weighing on you with respect to your mom and family concerns, life and work concerns. It's a big soup, but those were the big things. And I'm wondering if the writing of this memoir, was that how you kind of got out of it, or one of the main ways you got out of it? Did you write through it, or did you have to clear the depression in order to be able to write?
So I'll say, like, I went to this extremely private school in Houston called St. John's. It's like Elizabeth Holmes went there. I write about it in the book, like the woman who founded Theranos, who became like the first female tech billionaire or whatever, and then turned out to have built this entire empire on fraud. I knew her. Like we went to the same school. It was a K through 12 private school. Wes Anderson went there. He made Rushmore about it. It's a school that like imbues you with this sense of motivation and desire to succeed that is sort of beyond anything I've seen anywhere else. And it also kind of creates a little bit of maybe like a sociopathic tendency towards like success at all odds. And most people who come out of it become lawyers or, oil consultants or something and related to kind of like the Houston moneyed classes. I was never going to do that. But it's like if you take that, whatever that is, and put it into a writer, what you get is somebody who's like, well, I'm going to succeed at all costs, no matter what happens with my mental health. I did not care about my mental health. I wasn't protecting myself. I'm writing in this book about, my mom being institutionalized, not recognizing me, thinking that she is living in Ethiopia, that just complete delusion. And I'm experiencing that and I'm watching all of that. And it was horrible and it was so hard. And there was not a second where I was like, oh, I need to like be sure that I'm taking care of myself. I was only ever thinking like, I need to write this and I need to write it well, and the craft needs to be there and the skill needs to be there because it also needs to be like a valid piece of work in the world if I'm going to publish this, which I do not recommend. It was not a safe way to live. It was not a healthy way to live. It was that I don't know how to write or exist in any other way.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like this idea of like having a really strong drive. It sounds like you're a person who's really driven and you really want to be a writer and to make it as a writer. And that, I think that's a necessity on some level, but it can also become a kind of hindrance, or it can become toxic, and it can be kind of self-harming at a certain point, especially when you start comparing yourself to others. Now that you've published this book and you're having this success and you've sort of attained the goal, at least on some level, I don't know. I mean, maybe the novel is like the big thing that you're chasing after. I don't know. But like, has your relationship changed to your idea of success, or have you gained any kind of new insight or understanding now that you've gone through the whole process and found your way into the bookstore with a book that has your name on it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I thought that all writing was pain and it had to be constant sacrifice and pain because that's what writing the novel felt like. I had these terrible office jobs, but I would get a job where I'd have a cubicle and I had a printer, and whatever the job was something I could get done in an hour, and I would spend the rest of the day writing and researching, making $40,000 a year in communications at some stupid nonprofit or university. And those are, by the way, great jobs for writers. If anyone's looking for a job with health insurance, like you could probably get hired at a university doing admin work. But once this book came out, it's not so much the fact that like I'm in bookstores, even though that's nice and the reviews are really nice. It's more just that like people are reaching out to me and being so nice about it and saying, this has helped me in this way, or I saw myself in my relationship with my mother. One element of the book is that my mom has undiagnosed borderline personality disorder. She was extremely abusive when I was younger in a way that I had not really fully processed, and that I thought maybe once I wrote the book and I wrote about the things she had done to me, I thought people might say, well, it wasn't that bad, or it didn't really happen that way, or you're overreacting. But no one has said that. And kind of the empathy that I've received and the support that has been cathartic, and also the community that has arisen around it, just in terms of being able to go to events and have readings and have people come and ask questions and talk to them, and just being in a physical space with other people and the emotions that arise from that. Like that has been incredibly healing in a way that I was not looking for at all, did not expect, but has really fundamentally changed me, and that I would say is what success is for me now. So I wasn't looking for it, but I found it.
And is it people who might have a parent who's struggling with mental illness in particular? Like it's those people who are, I would imagine, reading this book and seeing themselves in it in a really powerful way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like it's just so lonely. Like when you're raised by a mother with a severe mental illness, I think in some ways, maybe even if you are loved by other adults in your life, the people in your world have kind of a vested interest in pretending that what's happening to you isn't happening, because it's difficult to absorb. It's sad, it's intense. And I think I was growing up in a really dark household, but I did have an aunt and a grandmother who loved me very much and took care of me and made sure that I understood that I was valid and my life was worthwhile. But there wasn't a lot of validation of what was happening at home. And so I kind of grew up in this way where I was constantly, it's probably like growing up the child of an alcoholic. It's similar, where you're kind of always trying to gauge people's moods. You're always trying to anticipate what terrible thing is going to happen if you're going to be punished for no reason. Everything feels unpredictable. I would often assume that strangers were angry with me, just based on sort of facial expressions I was misinterpreting. And a lot of that, now that other people have said, oh, I had the same experience, and this is also the way that I've been navigating life as a human, as an adult, I've kind of realized, like, okay, wait, I thought all of this stuff was true, but the reason that I thought this way about myself was because of my mother. And I was kind of living in a prison of my own making in terms of my views of the world, of myself. Yeah, it's hearing about other people's experiences and other people relating to the book, and hearing their stories that has kind of allowed me to free myself of that, for sure. So it's like, yeah, it's great that I'm hearing so much from other people who have experienced this or experienced something similar, but also like it's more than that. It's like, I feel like I deserve to be here and exist and be a writer, in a way that I did not before at all.
So just so people listening are clear, you mentioned that your mother had undiagnosed borderline personality disorder. Like that was what was afflicting her in your childhood. Mm-hmm. And then there was a schizophrenia diagnosis later in life. Like the onset of schizophrenia came later. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So she would not, I think sort of like I lay out in the book, as a kid, she would split. She was moody. We would be having a wonderful conversation, and then 2 seconds later, she would be furious at me for reasons I didn't understand. She would rant angrily at me for hours, for reasons I didn't understand. When I was a kid, she kind of treated me really, really badly, but she would never have gone to get psychiatric help or psychological help because that just wasn't something that my family did. So she wasn't ever diagnosed. But then in her 50s, she experienced a psychotic break while she was driving. She wound up getting picked up by the police because she parked on the freeway. And then I found out from my grandmother that she'd thought these men were chasing her down the highway for the past, I think, several months. She was sleeping in her car. She wasn't eating. She thought all of her food was poisoned. She thought people were following her in airplanes. But what I think probably was happening when I was younger was that there was maybe a buildup to that break happening this whole time, and we just didn't know what the signs were. We didn't know what we were looking for.
That's hard. And was there something that you discovered or learned about later that you think might have occasioned this break, or was it just like a lifetime of accumulation and suddenly it manifested? Like, did something happen in her life, prior to her stopping on the freeway that might have really triggered it?
Yeah, I think, when she was a teenager, her dad either killed himself or was killed at a garage that he owned. He was a businessman in Houston. He owned gas stations, and he worked with mechanics, and he was divorced from my grandmother at this time. He was also just a very bad man. He was very abusive to my grandmother. And then at some point he was found dead underneath, I think, a Cadillac that he was servicing. And my mom was just obsessed with his death for her entire life. My grandmother never addressed it. She didn't say to my mom or my aunt, I feel sorry for you. I'm sad that this happened. She basically just told them that he was dead, and then went on a business trip and left them with the babysitter and never spoke about it ever again. And I think my mom was 14 at that time. My aunt told me that my mom went into the closet and didn't come out for 24 hours. And I just think for her whole life, she was still in that closet. I think even now there's part of her that's still there. Just she loved her father very dearly, and just never got any answers, and so kind of spent her adulthood trying to figure out what had happened. Still never got any answers, but it was complicated because he was really physically abusive to my grandmother. My aunt says that she barely knew him. My mom probably already had some sort of underlying issues. So there is this question of like, well, was her perception of her father necessarily fully based in reality? Or was it kind of a symptom of these disorders that she was probably already suffering early symptoms of, even in childhood? So it's complicated.
Yeah, and it's generational too. It's complicated for you, as you write about in the book, to reckon with your mother and her treatment of you and her abuse of you when you were a child, and then trying to be compassionate towards her because of her diagnoses and the mental illness that she's struggling with, and then also just reckoning with that kind of intractable feeling of love that you have for your mom. It's a big thing to try to understand. And when it comes to the difficult moments that you had as a child at your mother's hand, you write about some of these in the book, and they're really harrowing to read about. I won't go into all of them, but just so listeners have an idea of what you were dealing with as a child, I have to ask you about the dogs. Like, I'm a dog person, so the dog sequence of the book is one of the most vivid and wrenching things that I've read in recent memory. Just heartbreaking. Can you just talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I was in middle school, maybe sixth grade. My mom and I got into an argument because we were out of dog food. We had 3 dogs, a mutt that someone had rescued off the side of the road, a purebred schnauzer that my grandmother had gotten us as a gift, and then another smaller schnauzer that I think my mom had bought me because she felt competitive with my grandmother about the things that she was able to provide for me. And we had these 3 dogs, and they were out of food, and I was upset about it, and my mom was angry with me for being upset about it and angry with me for asking her to go get more dog food. So she yelled at me. She said she wasn't going to get any more food, and then she left for the night. I don't know where she was going. And I was so upset that I threw something at the window of my bedroom and I broke it. And I was really scared of my mom. I knew that I would be punished for this. So I wrote her a note apologizing and left it at the bottom of the stairs so that when she came home, she would see it first thing. And when she got home and she read it, she came upstairs and she found me and she told me to put the dogs in the car. She had this Land Cruiser that my grandmother had bought her. And so she put the dogs in the car, and I got in the car and we drove to a Petco off the side of the freeway, and she opened the door and just let the dogs out. And I was so shocked and so scared, and I had no idea she was going to do that. She was angry with me. I was just basically paralyzed in fear, and it was the middle of the night, and she just like let them run off and then got back on the freeway with me in the car, and then they were just gone. The next day, nobody went to look for them. Nobody knew. Yeah. I was devastated. It was sort of the big rupture in our relationship that was never, ever repaired. And I don't think ever will be. And that was probably the worst thing that had ever happened to me up to that point, for sure. Maybe well into adulthood, maybe even now, because she made it very clear that it was my fault that this terrible thing was happening. And I thought, from that point, anything I ever do that makes someone else angry is going to lead to the total destruction of everything I love. So it really messed up my personality for a while. And, I didn't really get an apology. And I didn't know at the time that my mother was mentally ill. So I thought this was normal behavior. I thought that I deserved it,
How old were you?
I was probably 11. But when you're 11... Sorry, you don't know. You've never not been 11. It's the oldest you've ever been. You don't know that you're a child. You know what I mean? So now I have a niece who just turned 12, and I look at her and she's a baby, and it's like, how could anybody ever hurt this girl? But I felt like, oh, well, I had these responsibilities and I failed,
It's really cruel to do that to a child. You loved those dogs, as you write about. And yet, at that point, as you say, you didn't realize that your mother was mentally ill and was suffering. And later on in your life, you find out and you start to get some medical information. You try, you make attempts to get her medical help and medication and therapy and all the rest. I'm wondering if the diagnoses that she received later in life and the deeper understanding that you sort of have of her and what was causing all of this behavior, does that soften your feelings towards her? I mean, it must be so complicated to be wounded like that and to have that rupture as you described it, but to also have that love and then to also be like, well, in some respects, it's not entirely her fault. She's not in control of her neurochemistry. You know what I'm saying? There are things happening within her that are causing her to behave in this way that might not be who she really is. Right? Or no?
Yeah, no, I think the rage and the love have to exist at the same time in the same to the same degree. Because yes, she inherited incredible trauma. I mean, this is something that I think I figured out in writing the book. Just the fact that she was living in a home where her mother was being beaten by her father to the point where my grandmother had to go to the hospital and get stitches. My own grandmother's mother was severely depressed, basically bedridden for much of my grandmother's life. My mom inherited all of that, and she was playing out these patterns that were not necessarily. She didn't even know she was holding them. She didn't know that they had been given to her. But at the same time, I think each one of us does have a responsibility to our children, to our friends, to the people who love us, to kind of take accountability for those kinds of things and try to be better. But I'll say that, like, I had to give myself permission to feel this way. I felt like after she had the psychotic break, and I was really scared that she was going to hurt herself or that someone was going to hurt her because she was just sort of roaming the streets, destroying things and yelling at people and getting taken in by the cops all the time. I went home and I visited her, and this is not in the book, but I'd sent her a novel, something just to read while she was inside, and I mentioned it, and she said something kind of really sarcastic and bitchy back to me, and I was like, okay, you're still an asshole. Like, you're still, like, whatever medication you are not on is not going to fix the fact that you're just an asshole. And that's okay, like, yeah, our relationship will never be okay. I'll never have, like, the mother-daughter relationship that other people have. Psychosis medication does not fix whatever the symptoms of BPD are. I can still be angry, and I can still be angry for, like, the younger version of myself, and at the same time care for you deeply and want you to be safe and healthy and taken care of.
There's something very difficult about both of the diagnoses that your mother has received, borderline personality disorder. And I'm saying this as somebody from the outside looking in. But I think they're very mysterious. Schizophrenia and borderline are both kind of nebulous when you look into it. Like, and again, the limits of my investigation are like Wikipedia. So I don't know a ton, but right. I mean, it's like, what is it? How does it happen? Nobody really knows. Is there a cure? There's not really a cure, but it's not fatal. And I don't know if medical science has a great understanding of either. Is that your sense of things?
Yeah, with BPD, it's hard because a lot of therapists don't want to work with borderline patients because it's just really difficult to navigate.
What are some of the symptoms, just so people listening can just get like a general sense?
So extremely divergent sort of personalities that you'll see one after the other very quickly. My mom would be completely content one second and then enraged the next, and there would be no clear understanding of what the tripwire was because it was something that was happening in her head. Total delusion. She would sort of fabricate out of thin air things that she thought that I had done or said or was thinking about her that were not the case. For example, one time I remember, she picked me up from the airport and my bag got lost. Somebody else had taken my bag, and I managed to get the address from the airport of the person who had taken my bag because she'd left her bag behind and they were identical and it had a bag tag on it. And my mom, picking me up from the airport, offered to drive to the woman's house. And I was like, no, it's late. We can go the next day. My mom took that as like a total repudiation of her and her intelligence, in a way that made no sense and would not make any sense unless you were in her brain. And so she did not speak to me for the rest of that trip. I was visiting home. She didn't speak to me for the rest of it. She wrote me a really mean note about how angry she was with me. I think she didn't talk to me for months after that, based on something that she had invented in her brain. So things like that, I don't think people really talk about it. I think sometimes it does go unrecognized and undiagnosed. Yeah, it's just really unfortunate. And then with schizophrenia, there's more just sort of a debate, like a scholarly debate over whether it exists, whether it's a bunch of different disorders that have all been lumped together. This is something that goes back to Freud, who actually, in one essay that I love a lot, that he said, all of mankind is plagued by delusions that you kind of can't prove whether they're real or not. And that's true. We all kind of experience various levels of psychosis, but there's a collectively agreed upon reality, and then there's people who live outside of that collectively agreed upon reality, and those are the people we say have schizophrenia. So there's just sort of constant this back and forth over what you can't see it in the brain. It's not like there are brain lesions. Some people think it's caused by trauma. Some people don't. Some people take to medication. Some people don't. Yeah, so it's kind of just this ongoing thing where there's not a ton of conclusive research around it. There are shots that work. Nobody knows why. It's just the brain is a total mystery. It's like the deep sea. It's like the ocean. It's like space. There's just you can just go on forever and not find any answers.
And it's lonely, as you said. And there are multiple experiences in life, dark, difficult experiences usually. Like I think of being in deep grief, or someone's suffering a terminal illness, or another kind of really difficult illness, as we've been discussing, that causes people, even with the best of intentions, to sort of turn away. They don't want to be near it. It's too much, right? And there's something you said, and I do this every time I do an interview, where I write down all these notes and I don't source them. So it's either in the book or it's in an interview that you did about the book, where you say, what's interesting about having a loved one with an untreated mental illness is that the things they do and say often don't make any sense. So when you try to tell people what's happening, what you say comes out as incoherent. And I think I flagged that just because it speaks to this isolation and the challenge of trying to communicate just the basics of your lived reality with other people who are blessedly untouched by this. And you know what I'm saying? Like, they're not dealing with it and you're trying to tell them, but then even if you can get to the point where you're feeling safe enough to tell somebody, or somebody's actually willing to listen to you, you start to describe it and you sound incoherent. I think maybe there's an absurdity to that I recognize, and that, in kind of like a dark way, made me laugh a little bit, just as a matter of recognition. I have a disabled child, so like that's my thing, like trying to talk about that to people, and you just see people just like closing down. So I think maybe that's why you have to write a book about it, because it's like, okay, I don't know if this is going to be, not that I go to cocktail parties, but if I did, I don't think it's going to be the kind of thing you talk about at a cocktail party. But it's top of mind. It's obviously what's happening in your life. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a shame that you shouldn't be able to articulate it. And yet it resists articulation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're listening to me talk right now. When I was recording my audiobook, the director said, you have a very specific voice. And I know that I do. Like, it's kind of high-pitched. It's kind of Valley Girl. I know that I started talking like this because I'm from 3rd Ward in Houston, Texas, which, like, is the hood. And then when I was, like, in 1st grade, my grandmother put me into this private school. And I felt like, okay, I got to talk like these, like, rich white kids so that they will accept me. It was, like, I got to assimilate for my own survival as 7 years old. And that's just how I've talked ever since. But I have been told, you're hard to understand, you talk too fast, your voice is too high, blah blah blah. But in writing, it's like, okay, well, you're reading it. You're not listening to me talk. And this is maybe a way that I can sort of be more concrete and explicit, and you can understand what I'm saying without thinking about the tone that it's being delivered in. And so that, I think that's why I got into writing kind of early on. And then something that I have found with talking about my mother and with kind of her incoherent behavior was that often other writers will understand in a way that other people don't. So there's a story in the book about I'd co-written an opera. It was sort of the first big project I ever did that like was high profile, got a lot of media attention. It was called Hopscotch. It was in Los Angeles in 2015. The site-specific opera that took place in Cards. It was very experimental, and my mom came from Houston to see it. And we were in one of the scenes, which took place in a car, and had a tarot reader pulling cards and reading our fortunes, singing them. And it was beautiful. It was done so well. The production value was incredible. The opera had gotten profiled in the New Yorker. It was like the thing that got me my agent. I was like, I'm on my way. I was really, really happy. And then my mom doesn't speak to me. She goes back to Houston. She's not speaking to me. A week goes by. I'm really confused. I'm like, I thought things were good. And I find out that she thought that I was in a lesbian relationship with the tarot reader, and that I was cheating on my then boyfriend, now husband, and suddenly she was like expressing this homophobia that I had not ever known to be a part of her. She has a niece. I have a cousin who's non-binary. They've sort of always been welcomed in the family, but all of a sudden she was enraged, that just total lack of any kind of empathy or warmth, and just this like pure nonsensical, irrational anger at me for something that was not happening. I did not know this singer. I had never met this woman. I had nothing to do with the casting of the opera. And I find myself kind of going on the defensive and being like, wait, what is she sensing here? Am I crazy? And I would tell people that story, and most of the time people would laugh because it's so uncomfortable. But I said it, I remember I was at a residency, and I said it to Yelena Ikatorska, who's a Russian novelist. She wrote a novel called Panic in a Suitcase, that I loved. And I told her that story, and she was the one who was like, your mom probably has borderline personality disorder. Like, you should look into that, because that sounds very much like something. She had a friend who had written about it. And she was like, you should read this essay, and that's probably what's going on here. And she was the first person who had like not just been like, oh, how weird, oh, ha ha ha. Like, actually, like, there's something going on here. And no one had ever said that to me before. No one had really taken this story seriously. So I don't know. I do think in some ways writers maybe are more attuned to that kind of thing psychologically than other people.
Yeah, and maybe more psychologically predisposed to just be curious as opposed to like recoiling. Like writers, I think, among their virtues tends to be like a willingness to sort of look at difficult things, like, and to endure whatever discomfort that kind of comes with the territory. So that makes some sense to me. And I'm curious to know a little bit more about your upbringing. I think listeners would be fascinated to hear. You said you grew up in the Third Ward in Houston, which is where Beyonce grew up, right?
Absolutely.
Do you know each other? No, I guess.
I knew her sister. I went to theater camp with Solange, and we like co-starred in a play one summer. But she was already a star. She was already, she'd have to leave in the middle of the day to go on TV and do dances, and that they were already kind of being groomed into pop stars even when we were kids.
So you have that background, but then, like you said, you went to St. John's. That's the name of the school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, there's like prep schools, and then there's prep schools. This is like the mythologized prep school of Wes Anderson's Rushmore. And that there you are. Mm-hmm. And as I was reading about your life, I was like, it's really fascinating that you have this kind of varied background. You have, in many ways, a very privileged upbringing.
Absolutely.
St. John's, you went away to France for like an exchange program, and, had all these experiences that I was like, wow, you were very well educated. Then went on to Brown, and yet you're also dealing with, and your grandmother, a very successful small business owner who, the way that it's depicted in the book, I think leads a pretty privileged existence, or does well for herself, but then your mother struggling.
Yeah.
and your father sort of out of the picture, at least in an immediate sense, geographically, and it kind of comes and goes, but doesn't play like a key role in your upbringing in terms of childcare, right?
No. No.
So it's a mix, and I mean, I think as a child, that was just your reality, and maybe being at St. John's and maybe at a certain age, you start to realize differences more acutely, right? I mean, how early in your childhood did it become apparent to you? I guess you said you were at 7 and you were trying to talk like the white girls at school or whatever to just try to assimilate. But was it always there? Was this sense of difference and this kind of self-awareness of the uniqueness of your situation there from the jump, or is it something that you kind of grew into?
I think I'm only just now realizing the uniqueness of it, but it's interesting because my grandmother, yes, was a successful small business owner. Her grandparents were sharecroppers. They got out of Nacogdoches, Texas. She grew up in Marshall, which was a slightly bigger town in East Texas. And then she was like, she was beautiful. She was the valedictorian. She was popular. She was in the newspaper all the time. There are these photos of her with this big beehive hairdo, getting her master's, getting scholarships, starting her businesses, and she really valued work. And I don't know where that came from for her because it's not something that was modeled. But she kind of knew that if she worked really hard, it didn't matter. She faced racism at University of Texas. Her husband, like I said, was abusive, but she seemed to know that if she worked really hard, she would be okay. And that was something that was really imbued into me. Whereas, so when I went to this school, I was like, yeah, I'm different. Yeah, all these kids live in River Oaks, which was like the Beverly Hills of Houston. But I can do this. I can be the best. I can be the smartest. I can be the most competitive. I can make these kids jealous of me. I can make them want to be friends with me. And I had like a really strong sense of empowerment. I felt very much like I could make this work. And I think for my mom, she wanted to be sure that I understood that I was not like these white kids. I didn't have the money that they had. I would not have the opportunities that they would have, the kinds of generational wealth that they had. That was just not going to be a reality for me. And I think she had a lot of resentment about the fact that I did assimilate so much, that I had white friends, that I was pretty socially successful there. And that was kind of a rift between us from the beginning. She had a lot of resentment. And I was like, no, I'm just going to make this work for me. Like and there's a scene in the book where I'm like, you know what? We're all the same. It's fine. Like, I'm not that different from these white kids. And she's like, you are not the same. You will never be the same. And then that turned into something when I grew up where I was like, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe the fact that I do feel comfortable in these two worlds means that I'm not Black enough. I'm not in touch with my identity enough. My husband's white. The guys I dated were white. Maybe I'm missing something crucial, but at the same time, I feel pretty good about my life. And I had kind of an identity crisis that was really exacerbated at the time that this book is being written. It's 2017. It started to feel like Black women were being presented as sort of symbols of disenfranchisement, disempowerment, lack, that in a way that did not reflect my own experience or my own identity or any of my friends. And it felt like some people were complicit in this representation in a way that was sort of helpful for them commercially or economically. It just felt like my identity was being commodified in a very vacuous way. And I was thinking about that, and I was sitting with that, and I was very angry about it. And I was like, I want to know what it is that I'm so angry about. Is it these tweets that I'm seeing about Black women all being lumped together in this really essentializing way that doesn't reflect my identity, which I know is very privileged, but also is making it seem like we all have the exact same experience? What am I so angry about? Because really, these people don't actually exist. They're just people online. Like, what am I talking about when I'm like, what does it mean to be Black enough? What does it mean to be like a Black woman? And that ended up being a really core part of the book too. Like me trying to answer that question for myself. Like, why am I reacting like this to this moment? The way Black women are being displayed or depicted in this sort of larger political conversation. Why am I so angry about this, about feeling erased in it? I had to figure that out. You know, I had to like really figure out where that was coming from and what that was.
Where was it coming from?
I did not like feeling like suddenly racism, TM, was like a commodifiable word. And I don't know how that happened or why it happened. I don't know that the conversation around it at that time was helpful or productive for just typical sort of normal Black women on like a larger scale. And then I think for me, the sort of specific reason I was so angry about it was because part of the reason that my novel ended up failing was because at a certain point, my agent said to me, again, this book is about time travel. It's about the multiverse. It's about Walter Benjamin. And she asked me if I could make it more like Sorry to Bother You, which is a Boots Riley movie by a Black Boots Riley is a Black avant-garde experimental filmmaker from the Bay Area. Sorry to Bother You is a movie starring Lakeith Stanfield and Armie Hammer about a call center that it turns out is a front for these like mutant horses. I don't know. It's very strange. Have you seen this movie? Do you know this movie?
No.
Okay. It was a really big deal, and I want to say maybe 2017, and it was sort of part of that sort of raising that wave of awareness and conversation, and that sort of shudder of racial awareness that was going through the zeitgeist. And she was like, "Well, maybe you can make it more like that." And I was like, "Well, no, but that's not what this book is." And I totally lost faith and lost trust in the entire sort of several years we had been working together, because it seemed like she was like, "You need to make it Blacker in order for it to sell." And I was like, okay, yes, some of the characters in this book are Black, but it's fundamentally a love story, and that's not what it's about. So I think I had not expressed anger at that time or allowed myself to feel it, but I think I had a lot of rage about that built up, that then I was like, okay, this is part of this larger conversational force where I'm being essentialized and commodified and turned into something that I don't, or sort of my experience is being told to me in a way that like is not accurate and is in some ways harmful. And you know, I had these sort of quotes up in my office from Tracy K. Smith, who's this incredible poet, where she said something like, "It's crazy the sense of shame that can arise because of the complications that your own identity carries for others." So the fact that, yes, I'm a Black woman who's deeply rooted in my own sense of heritage, but I talk the way I do. I went to white schools, but I have a lot of privilege, but I fought for that privilege, but I worked really hard to get scholarships. I didn't grow up with a ton of money, but I am pretty empowered. And, you know, at this point in my life, I'm a homeowner in Los Angeles. Like, those things matter. That counts. Those details matter. My life experience is different from other Black women's life experience. But that is complicated for people. And what does it mean that I feel like the conversation about Black women has been so polarized? And again, in ways that make me angry. And there's this James Baldwin quote that I had also put above my desk. It's just about sort of like being Black in America. I'm paraphrasing, but being Black in America means always being subject to kind of like the knee-jerk reflexes that other people experience when they look at you. And so I was kind of like, okay, I feel like the world is trying to tell me my own story. People are telling me the story about myself that I don't think is true. So I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to just be honest and tell the story of my life and just see what happens. Because I don't see it reflected back at me. I know that it's true. I know that it's also not entirely unique. There are other people who've had similar experiences. And my hope is that people will be curious about that and want to know more about it. And so far that has been the case. And I've been really grateful for that.
Yeah, you're speaking for yourself.
Yeah.
I get that. Like, you know, like not wanting to just like have your story characterized, you know, have your life characterized in a certain way in kind of a big, broad brushstrokes cultural conversation that kind of elides all of the specifics and the things that actually make you, you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So I want to get into the writing of this book again. You started it in 2017, and then in 2019 you signed with your current agent, right? Mm-hmm. Claudia Ballard. And you did a lot of revision on the book, and I know that the book benefited a lot from Claudia's input, but also from the editorial input that you got once the book sold, which it did fairly quickly. Like you went out on submission, and what was it, like a week? Was it one of these books that got bought pretty quickly like that, or was it longer?
It was 3 weeks, which at the time felt so long. I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to sell. But it happened to coincide with the holidays, and I was traveling with Justin. And we took like a post-COVID honeymoon because we got married right before COVID. And so I told my agent, I was like, I'm in Amsterdam. Please do not call or email me with bad news. I only want to hear from you if it's good news. And she was like, okay. And I think a week later, she called and left a message and was like, I have good news. So I think I left for that trip 2 weeks after the book went out. And then she called me a week later while we were traveling. So yeah, 3 weeks.
So where were you exactly when you got this news?
I think I was in Estonia. I was in Tallinn, maybe. Or I might have that backwards. We might have started out in Tallinn and then gone to Amsterdam. But yeah, somewhere in one of those like cold European countries.
And how did it feel?
It felt surreal. I don't know. It felt surreal. It was interesting because before I had left, she told me there was interest. There was like serious interest from an editor that I had met with, who I really liked, Jenny Zhu, who ended up acquiring the book. But she was kind of a very new editor. I think I was the first book she acquired, and she convinced her boss to buy it. She asked me if I could write a letter explaining what I was going to do to make it better. And I don't think my agent wasn't familiar with this practice. And I was like, what does this mean? And it turned out it was because normally they would acquire nonfiction books on proposal. I didn't have a proposal. I'd written an entire manuscript. So she needed something. We ended up kind of reverse engineering the proposal, starting with this letter, which she was able to use to sell the book. And then once she bought it, the first revisions involved me doing this outline where I basically just rebuilt it brick by brick into the book that I had laid out in this letter. And it was such a smart move. It made the book so much better. The book that came out is not the book that I sold at all. And that process took, oh my gosh, I sold it in 2021. I guess it must have gone to print in March of last year. So, a couple years of writing and rewriting.
And the ways that it benefited most were like what, structural?
Emotionally. I was so in that world of experimental work. I love Maggie Nelson. The Argonauts was a big model for this book. I'm forgetting the name of the author who wrote Green Girl, but I'd sort of written a series of vignettes, and they were sort of beautifully written and lyrical, and in that way, kind of the craft was there, but the underlying kind of messier emotions were something I was really afraid of. And I think that makes sense because in my personal life, I tend to shy away from emotion, probably because of my childhood. And Jenny was the one who said, we're going to rebuild this in layers. So we're going to talk about your family's relationship to ambition. We are going to think about mental illness and how that has like actually affected you on a day-to-day level. And that's going to be another layer. So it's like this question of, what does success mean for you? What does illness mean for you? And then, there was the friendship layer, and we're going to just build on top of that until we get to a base manuscript that is the thing that this book could be. And she was just really patient with me, and we just built that book like layer by layer until we got to something that felt like it had a real narrative arc. It had like a real question that it was answering by the end.
As opposed to being just like a series of episodes or vignettes, like it made it into a book.
Yeah, a book with a plot, basically, like a story, as opposed to like, oh my god, look what I can do with words, look what I can do with language, look how funny I can be. More like she gave the book heart, I think, and she helped me kind of approach some of the uh, touch points, especially the emotional touch points that I had really I'd been shying away from, and hoping that I could disguise that avoidance with like fun lyrical tricks and references and yeah.
Doesn't work. You got to. It's like this. It's the old Steve Allman line. You got to slow down where it hurts.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. And I
So
don't
it's
do that, but she made
yeah,
me.
but she helped you do that.
Yeah.
And then now, the book is here and it's in the world. And I can't leave the conversation without asking you about one part of it that piqued my interest, and it's the ketamine therapy section, which you did kind of your own volition.
Mm-hmm.
That feels very like contemporary. I feel like ketamine therapy is hot right now. But I'm curious to know, like, can you talk a little bit about like how you came to be interested in it, and then what it was actually like to go through it?
I mean, yeah, I do live in LA and I work in TV, and I'm surrounded by people who are always trying whatever the sort of latest new therapy is. And so I had a friend who was a director, and her husband had lifelong depression and tried this out. And I just started making money. It was like the first real money I'd ever made in my entire life, because I'd started staffing in TV. And I think where most people might have bought a car, I was like, I'm going to buy ketamine therapy because it's basically the same cost as a used Toyota Corolla. And I would have to take a lift across town to Santa Monica to this therapist's office. And the way it worked was that we'd have a normal therapy session. A doctor would come, inject me with ketamine. I would hallucinate for an hour. I would talk, she would take notes, and then I would do a second therapy session based on the trip that I had had. I think I did this.
What were the trips like? What like was it like? Have you done psychedelics like mushrooms or LSD? Like, is it similar to that or different?
I've done it all. I've done it all. It's different. It's much more powerful. And maybe because it's a therapeutic dose and you're being injected under supervision, as opposed to me just being like in a backyard in Providence at Brown, like doing whatever tab of acid somebody happened to get from someone, with no
Right.
um, which is fun in its own way. This was like, it was so purposeful, and the therapist would make these beautiful playlists. And what ended up happening actually every single time was I would be reduced to this like atom of self. So I was no longer a body. It was just like whatever the most like minimalist form that the self can take. That's what I was. And I would be writing down this river, this like stream, and I would be experiencing emotions and memories and what felt like, old lives, whatever the opposite of reincarnation is, what past life, visions, and all the sort of stuff that comes with trips. But I remember sort of the two things that felt the most valuable to me and that felt the most real and that I've carried with me are one, I experienced a vision of like a pump, like a projector, like this thing where it was like taking in everything that I was experiencing and then processing it and putting it back out as whatever my experience of reality is. So there, obviously, I'm sure you've read the books and you're aware of this sense that like objective reality is like not real reality. We don't actually know what the physical world is. We only process it through our five senses. But there's so much more out there that we're not actually able to experience. And this is something that there's a psychiatrist, Dan Siegel, who's written several books about this that I had already sort of read and processed for the manuscript. This question of like, what is reality versus what we actually experience as reality. But I saw it. I saw the projector. I saw the pump. I saw the thing. I saw the thing that I am, which is just everything I think or like thoughts and emotions is coming from these other sort of sources of input that I kind of do and do not control, that I can make a more concerted effort to control in terms of the way that I think about my life and the world and my emotions and my past. And that was something that helped me structure the book a lot because I was writing this book while I was doing ketamine therapy. And I just realized I had a lot more control than I understood. And then the other thing was this image of a waterfall where I was sort of in this, like the pool at the bottom of a waterfall, and the water that was falling was just like this immense love. And that was just, that place was a place that I could go to, that I was able to access because of these drugs, and then that I can still go to now. That's just there. There's just this like infinite resource of love for all of us. And I kind of just came out of it with this sense of like, the universe loves us and it's happy that we are here, and it wants us to experience it, and it wants us to be happy. And I think that's true. I just do. I just do. I think I have, that's sort of become a guiding force for my life ever since. Like, it's, what are the chances that we exist? They're minuscule. They're nothing. And the fact that we're here matters. And there is a sense of intention behind it that I want to honor and that I care about a lot.
So you can get back to that waterfall in the pool? You can go back there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I gotta find, I need a map. I gotta find the waterfall.
I mean, I'm like, if you are ever just, yes, it's so expensive, it's unsustainably expensive, but it's probably the most positive therapeutic experience I've ever had. And the other thing is that it distances you from your nervous system. So much of like your reactions, so much of your reactivity, and just things for me, like getting into fights with my husband or being self-destructive or being impulsive, was coming from things that were happening in my body that I wasn't in tune with at all. But the medication makes it so that you experience those triggers, but you do not react. You just experience them, and then you can observe your experience of them. It just slows everything down. So while I was in treatment, I was able to just accept things so much more readily, and that led to so much less conflict in my daily life. And I just was leading such a healthier life. And that is a physical impact that does not last. But if you can remember what it's like, it helps a lot. And if you're super wealthy, I guess you can just keep doing the injections for as long as you need to. And I think it would lead to a lot of improvement.
Yeah, that's the hard part, I find, with psychedelics, is the integration and like how slippery it is and ephemeral. And, you know, you have these great epiphanies, but then like a month later, you're sort of back in your bullshit, right?
Mm-hmm. It's like that with self-help books for me, though, too. Everything. It's like that with it's like that with therapy. It's just, I've kind of come to terms, I've resigned myself to the fact that I just will have to constantly be looking for new resources that I can, integrate for 3 months at a time. And then I find something else. And then that's the thing that works.
So another thing that I want to make sure we touch upon is Walter, and you mentioned him earlier, but Walter, is it Benjamin?
Yeah.
This was part of your novel, that you developed this obsession with him. But can you just talk about why Walter Benjamin is so interesting to you?
Yeah, so he is a German literary critic who, when I was in college, his masterwork, The Arcades Project, which is about modern Paris and how it became modern, but is sort of this large, kind of messy portfolio of excerpts and quotes and bits of essays that he'd written over several years and kind of dedicated his life to, but never actually managed to finish. It was finally translated from German into English by a professor that I admired a lot when I was at Brown. And I ended up failing out of that professor's class because I was experiencing severe depression. And I was really depressed about that specifically, because he was somebody who had shown me, who just seemed to have a lot of faith in me and whose work I cared about a lot. And so I carried that with me out of college into grad school, and at some point was like, I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to read the entire Arcades Project. I read all of his critical essays. Probably the most famous one is The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which is what you read if you study comp lit in college. He would theorize art and this aura that art has. And the thing that I loved about him was that he writes in such a way that you can, as a layperson, you can just understand it. He's just walking around Paris all the time having epiphanies, probably stoned out of his mind. But he just like walked around and looked at things and thought about them and wrote the thoughts down. And I thought his writing was so beautiful. His search for sort of a unifying theory of the universe was something that I really empathized with, because that's something that I'm always searching for answers in that way. He was kind of tragic, his existence, in that he wanted desperately to be famous and successful. I think he has a quote where he said he wanted to be like the most famous living literary critic, and he was very admired in these circles, but he kind of met failure at every turn, even in terms of the Arcades project. He worked on it for so long. When he finally submitted it to the journal that I think had commissioned it or expressed interest in it, they rejected it. They said basically that it was facile, that it was too metaphysical, that it didn't have any sort of concrete bearing on reality in terms of theory or moving the field along. And then shortly after that, he died trying to get out of Vichy, France, crossing the border into Spain, and he climbed the Pyrenees. This sort of very difficult journey. He was not in great health, and he was stopped at the border and told that he would have to turn back because he didn't have a visa. And rather than turn back and try to make the journey again, he overdosed on morphine. But then because of his death, they opened that border, and the people that he had been traveling with were allowed to cross, possibly because he was a high-profile figure who killed himself at the border, or coincidentally, it's unclear. There are sort of differing accounts. But the fact that his death led to these people's freedom, and then the fact that after that, the Arcades project, this failed project, was discovered and translated and kind of built this sort of cult following, and so much of his work has filtered through graduate departments and undergraduate departments, and pretty much anybody who studies literature to any degree is familiar with him. It means that sort of posthumously he found the success that he had dreamt of his whole life. And I just thought there was something so tragic and beautiful about that story that I couldn't shake. I was like, I gotta write a novel about this guy. How can there not be a novel about this guy? And that novel failed. And now I've written this book. And it's actually so funny because so much of the research that I had done for the novel and wound up in this book. And at some point, my publicist said to me, just so you know, she was talking about this big celebrity book club. And she was like, they actually were really interested in it and they liked it a lot. And usually I can't even get a response from these people. It means so much that they liked it, but they were not fully certain that their readers would be into the Benjamin stuff. So that's why they didn't choose you as their like big book of the month. And it's the kind of book club where like it would have instant bestseller status. Like it would have been a huge deal for me. And she was just like, yeah, the Benjamin stuff. They were just like, I don't know. And I get it. I totally get it. But I don't regret it at all. Like I needed to tell his story. I can feel sometimes when I talk about it in readings, people's eyes kind of glazing over. But I don't care. I feel like it's just, I needed to write the thing that I wanted to write,
Yeah. I think like a couple things come to mind. First of all, I think it is somewhat common for writerly people to take a lot of heart in stories of writers who become like very beloved and well-known posthumously. It's always like, see, there's still hope. I don't know. And there's something poignant about that, right? And then the other thing is that it calls to mind a conversation I've had more than once on this show and just had recently when I was talking to Matthew Zapruder about how to write poetry, like how to make a poem. And there's a line that he quotes from the poet Robert Haas about sort of this very thing where you're working on something and it's resisting you or you're having trouble with it or there's failure, or, whatever it is. And Robert Haas says, like, put the problem in the poem. Mm-hmm. Like whatever problem it is that you're having, put it in the poem. And so I recognized when I was reading your memoir that the Benjamin section was you putting the problem in the poem. It was like, yeah, it didn't work in this novel that you were trying to write, but then you wrote about the problem of that novel not working, which involved, Benjamin, and it ended up in this memoir. And what I think is a sort of beautiful tribute. And I think that it speaks to like the core of the book or part of the core of the book, which is your deep desire to be like I always say capital R writer, but like that's just tongue in cheek, and to get a book done and to make your way in this field. And I think, we all want recognition, at least on some level. And so to follow his story and to respond to it in the way that you did, like, makes an emotional sense. So those people at the Celebrity Book Club don't know what they're talking about.
Tell that to some of the Goodreads reviewers as well. I try not to read my Goodreads reviews, but there have been some complaints about the Benjamin stuff. But again,
Whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever. So I guess like a good place to end is simply to ask, I mean, you talk about the reception of the book and Goodreads, like, you know, it's out there now, so it's not really all yours anymore, right? It belongs to whoever reads it. I'm curious to know, since it's such a personal book, what it has been like to publish it in the context of your family.
Mm-hmm.
Has your mother read it? Is, you know, how is your family in particular, and friends and your husband, you know, like, what has that part of it been like for you?
So I tried really hard to make sure that they felt like a part of it to some degree, kind of throughout. You know, I made sure they knew once it was like a real thing that it was happening. I sent it to my grandmother and my aunt to read. I did wait, pro tip for anyone else in this situation, wait until it's typeset and copy edited so it looks like a real book, because then I think, one, people are less likely to tell you no, and then also it's just a sense of respect. You know, I respect your story and I respect your role in my story, and just to give someone a professional document in that way. And you know, there's an artistic collaborator who's a close friend who's in it, who asked to read it because she's kind of got her own profile and she wanted to make sure that it wouldn't basically mess up her Google results in a way. And so I let everybody choose their own pseudonym, or any sort of projects that we'd worked on together. I let them choose basically how we wanted to couch that in a way that made sense. And I really think for my family, I mean, they love me. My grandmother and my aunt, they want me to be happy and successful. They want me to have the life that I want. And I think that's more important to them than anything else. So there was never any sense from them that I was hurting the family or anything like that. I think it made my grandmother sad. You know, I don't know that she has finished the book or even read it, but I know that she's happy that it exists and that it's doing well. My aunt read it, copy edited it, sent it to her friends. So proud of me, so happy. That's actually been really great. My mom is not quite in a state to understand what it means. You know, like, I would interview her and I would record the interviews and I would tell her they're happening and I would tell her they're about the book. But for most of that time, she was unmedicated. So she just it wasn't something that she could take in any way. And then now I don't know that she would just even be interested in it. She's just kind of on a different plane. It's not, we also don't really have much of a relationship, unfortunately. My husband, this is so funny. He's, like I say in the book, he has probably some form of obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And so for him, it was more just a question of like, I'm going to copy edit this for you and make sure that the continuity is working and there's no typos, like that kind of thing. And he's not in any, you know, I think he's in some ways a hero of the story, but he's not presented in any way as like a flawless figure.
I thought he was the funniest character in the book.
Good.
Like, he's kind of like maddeningly rational. Like, you're freaking out and he's like asking you all these very like rational questions. You know, I don't know. There's something comedic about his presence in the book a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think there's something comedic about his presence in my life because that very much is our relationship. I freak out about existential things and he is very rational about those, but then he freaks out about like the kitchen towels being in the wrong place. And I can be like, okay, that's not actually the end of the world. So
yeah, I can relate. I think he and I are simpatico. Like, the kitchen towels, how hard is it to just hang those fucking things up? I mean, come on.
Yeah, no, that's his, those are sort of his big, we call them like Justin troubles and Sarah troubles. And we're good at like helping each other with our troubles because they're always on completely different wavelengths. So yeah, he is, there's a point in the book where I'm kind of like spiraling and I'm upset because I'm fighting with my friend and I'm like, just tell me what's wrong with me. And then he like very explicitly lays out everything that's wrong with me, like line by line. He's like, well, you're kind of selfish. You don't care a ton about other people except when it comes to your writing. You're a little bit judgmental. And it's like, he's not saying it in a mean way, and there's not, and in the next paragraph he's like, I love you and I believe you and I want you to finish your novel. Like, there's no sort of like emotion or resentment attached to that. It's just how he operates. I'm like, tell me what's wrong with me, and he's like, okay, well, maybe it's this, and maybe we can figure it out together. And that's very much our relationship.
So, last thing, the title of the book. And I don't have it right in front of me, so I hope I don't screw it up. No One Gets to Fall Apart.
Yeah.
That's it. Mm-hmm. That's a great title. And I'm just curious to know how you landed on it. Because it might, I don't know. I'm just like, wow. That's a title that holds a lot. And that speaks, I think, deeply to maybe not just your personal story, but maybe to the larger human story. Can you just talk to me about why you got to that title?
I was thinking specifically about a moment in the book where I think I tried very intentionally to fall apart because everything was going wrong. And I was like, well, if my mom's going to lose her mind, then I'm just going to lose my mind too. And you kind of realize that even when you give up on everything and you're just like, I'm done, you fall to the floor and it's a tragedy, you have to get up. You still have to get up. As long as you're alive, you have to get up and you have to do the next thing. You can't fall apart because time keeps going and things just keep going. And then you get up and things get better. And that has been the case for me. It's been the case for my mom. This book is about a moment of crisis, but ultimately she does end up in a group home and winds up choosing to take medication. And it took a long time and a lot of care, but she got there. So I think that, and then sort of on a larger scale, especially involving my mom, I think she tried her best when she was at her worst to completely self-destruct in terms of she would wander the highway and was sort of putting herself in these very dangerous situations because she was delusional. But even though my grandmother, who, as I outline in the book, is in kind of complete denial about the existence of mental illness at all, was not able to sort of comprehend her diagnosis, my grandmother made sure that she was cared for, that she had a home, that she was fed. And so did my aunt. My aunt made sure she wasn't always alone if she didn't want to be. So there was this community that just reached out constantly. As my mom was trying to spiral away into space, somebody was always just reaching out a hand no, you don't get to fall apart alone. You're just going to come back. You're going to come back. And I feel like that's been the case for me at my most depressed and my most self-destructive. I've had a friend or a loved one or a family member or my husband to just be nope, I'm just going to take your hand. You're going to stand up. You're going to stand up and you're going to keep going. And I think there's something really beautiful in the sense of salvation that community offers all of us. So that's kind of what I was trying to speak to.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. It has been so great to talk with you. Congratulations on the publication of this memoir. I always ask people if they're working on anything else. It sounds like you've got a lot of irons in the fire. You're writing for TV. You're doing that. But are you writing another book? Are you going to finish this novel, or is the Anatomy? What is it called again?
The Anatomy book is dead. That is not ever.
It's like the drawer novel. It's going in the drawer.
I tried to. My therapist was like, as an exercise, you should go and just delete all the files. And I tried to, but that's actually kind of impossible in the digital world today because there's my Google Drive and there's various laptops, there's hard drives. It's always going to be somewhere. But I do think maybe because of my mom's illness and maybe because of just sort of the political landscape, the climate landscape, it just feels like fiction is not necessarily the place where I want to spend my writing time. And that could change, never say never. But as of now, I think I'm going to stay in the memoir world. And I think my next book will be about, during the WGA writers' strike, my husband and I got very invested in the shelter crisis that's happening with animal shelters in LA County and in the city. They're incredibly overcrowded. Dogs are being euthanized for space, healthy pet animals. And that world of volunteers and networkers and people trying to get these dogs out of these kennels where they're not being walked into homes is fascinating. And I think I'm going to write a book about that.
All right. Well, that sounds interesting. I'm a dog person, so I don't know if I'll probably be weeping, but we'll have to brace myself. I'll have to brace myself. I'm sure it'll be heartening too. So I wish you luck with it. Thank you so much for making the time to talk with me.
Thank you. I love your podcast. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. It's great to talk to you.